This is the most difficult of all of the phases of this education. And why it's difficult has nothing to do with you. For you, it can be a culmination, an understanding of where you've been and where you are, and in that sense, enjoyable. But the lives that we're leading are buried in a sediment, and this sediment is under pressure and turning into shale, and probably become coal in another 100 years. And because of this general planetary ambiance, history is the most difficult of all processes. It's difficult because it requires individuality to navigate. You have to be who you are in order to get anywhere in history. And this being who you are includes a recognition of yourself. In very ancient times, there was no history. In fact, we can see that with the introduction of writing some 5,500 years ago, there were very early king lists, and there was very early record keeping for financial transactions. And these chronological king lists and these detailed account ledgers are precursors to history, but they are not themselves history. The appearance of history, as a conscious, individuated process, only dates back about 2,500 years. And 25 centuries is not a very long time in terms of a species to acclimate oneself to the vicissitudes of how that works. But the recent newness of history and its advanced conscious quality are not the main resistances. They are problems, they are challenges, but they are not resistances. Something new and something higher as challenges will bring forth a response. But resistances squelch response. And the resistance comes from the level of myth. History, as it develops, its working displaces the working of myth. And so the mythic habituation acts as a depressant, as a regression on the achievement of competence in history. This particular problem is so ingrown over the last 2,500 years. Most human populations, most large-scale historical movements have produced in their wake a kind of deepening of regression. That is to say, from the very beginning, some 2,500 years ago, when histories were first made, conscious histories were first made, there was a phenomenon of cultural reaction and regression for the levels of consciousness in individuals for a brief period afterwards. Brief to us, long for them. Usually a generation or more. And this seems to be one of the real drawbacks to making any kind of advance, any kind of improvement on our being able to handle history, on our individuality being able to navigate across the ocean of history to achieve a further maturity on the other side. Now, as we will see in our education, the further maturity on the other side is an objective understanding of science. For the moment, just let science be as something general. But there's no way to achieve science without history. Science, in fact, comes out of history. Let's come to this major regressive point. Let's review again something that we have found for the last 3 or 4 months. And that is, in our nature, the way that we actually occur, the way that we have grown up, the way in which our lives are, we can keep track of a certain frame of reference. In fact, it's called a frame of reference. We can keep track of a situation that has 4 sides, that has 4 corners. A square as the basic symbolic shape of it. When we are able to frame something, we then have a picture. And as long as we stay within that frame, we're in the picture. It really doesn't matter how big the frame is or how big the picture is. One remembers the British phrase at the height of their empire, the big picture means the British Empire. And if you're in the picture, then you have coordination, you have reference points, you know who you are, you know who other people are. For instance, most of us grew up during the Cold War, and the frame of reference of the Cold War was surprisingly simple. Surprisingly simple-minded. It was the United States and the Soviets. It was the good guys and the bad guys. It was East and West. And those were 2 polarities that set up the basic ordination of the frame of reference. And now that the Cold War is no longer there, we see again a characteristic backslide. Individuals are somewhat nebulous. They're slipping in ambiguity. But what regresses at an alarming rate is the situation for civilization. Civilization has regressed all the way back to the 1950s already, and it's just beginning. This particular problem in our lives with the Cold War has happened every single time a great war has been fought. Every single time. It is a characteristic, symptomatic readout. And the first person to ever recognize this, to understand this, was the Greek historian Thucydides, who lived about 2,500 years ago. And that's why we begin the history section with Thucydides. Because Thucydides' book, The History of the Peloponnesian War, is exactly the first conscious recognition of what has become an archetypal problem in civilization. he writes in here, Thucydides, the Athenian, wrote the history of the war fought between Athens and Sparta, beginning the account at the very outbreak of the war, in the belief that it was going to be a great war, and more worth writing about than any of those which had taken place in the past. My belief was based on the fact that the two sides were at the very height of their power and preparedness, and I saw too that the rest of the Hellenic world was committed to one side or the other. Even those who were not immediately engaged were deliberating on the courses which they were to take later. This was the greatest disturbance in the history of the Hellenes, affecting also a large part of the non-Hellenic world, and indeed I might almost say the whole of mankind. For though I have found it impossible, because of its remoteness in time, to acquire a really precise knowledge of the distant past, or even of the history preceding our own period, yet after looking back into it as far as I can, all the evidence leads me to conclude that these were periods where they were not great, either in warfare or anything else. And then he goes on, after a few other paragraphs, to say, but the real reason why I write this is that knowing now what I do about conscious personality, and knowing what I know now about historical processes, all of this will happen again and again and again until human beings learn not to participate in this pattern, not to do this scenario. And the whole reason of writing the history of the Peloponnesian War was to put up a warning, a poison sign. Don't drink this water. Now, we will see over the next 4 weeks. We'll get a chance to look at some of the highlights of this. But the basic thrust of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War has to be understood in this way. That history for Thucydides was able to be focused into a limited theme, that the best, most poignant history is one that chooses a theme for itself and carries the theme all the way through. That whatever is necessary to investigate, to fill out that theme, should be investigated to the best of your ability. Whatever is subsidiary to it should be looked at, and then a decision made whether it really goes with it, whether it really contributes, and in what proportion it does. And those aspects of life, even major aspects of life, that do not directly advance the theme, the delineation of the theme, the maturation of the theme to its completion, the telling of the history of whatever that theme is, that should be let go temporarily, momentarily. It's not a part of that history. So that the very first thing that we learn is that Thucydides did not write a history of Greece. He did not write a history of Athens. He did not even write a history of the number one concern of his, which was the civilization of the classical Greeks. But he wrote a history of the war which threatened that civilization and indeed tore it apart. One of the most profound of all the classicists who lived at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century was a German, Ulrich von Wilhelmowitz-Mühlendorf. And his editions were for 100 years the editions that everyone read. He wrote in 1908, Thucydides reviews the mass of events and chooses, by his own insight, the part that is worthy of recital. This past he undertakes to describe while it is actually happening. He works to that end, and what lies outside his theme does not interest him. So the very first thing to recognize here is that this book is a square, a reference. And this reference looks at a single object, an object whose unfolding took more than a generation. It lasted from 431 to 404 BC. It was generally 2 10-year periods with a hiatus in between. And what Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War does is to show us, with a kind of dispassionate, witnessing consciousness, exactly how this particular historical process unfolded, and by implication, how it threatened the civilization of classical Greece. Now, what's poignant here is that Thucydides is the second historian. The very first historian was also Greek, Herodotus, who lived about a generation or so before Thucydides. And in Herodotus' book, simply called Historia, the Histories, Herodotus' history includes the Persian Wars. And the Persian Wars, the wars between the Persian Empire and classical Greece, were extremely difficult engagements, also divided into 2 parts. The first part maturing around 490 BC, the second part around 480 BC. But the maturation of the war between the Persian Empire and Greece were largely 2 battles, one in 490 at Marathon, one in 480 at Salamis. Thucydides says that neither of these engagements, and in fact the whole Persian Wars, were not on the same scale as the war that was fought, that he is chronicling, that he is transforming into a history. The Peloponnesian War was fought by the 2 great powers, the 2 great polarities within that civilization itself. Not someone from outside that civilization threatening it, but from inside. So that the very heart, the very core of that civilization pitted one element against the other. And he describes why it is that this is a universal standoff, and that any time a great civilization will rise, it will also be impelled by the very processes that go to make it up towards a great war, and that eventually that great war will set up a polarity exactly like the Peloponnesian War, and the result will be that both sides will exhaust themselves, and what will suffer most is the status of conscious civilization, and that the backsliding can be of indefinite length. There's no net to catch anyone. In fact, the only safe spot, the only secure spot, is to regress all the way back to candle burning, back to the level of ritual, or back to the level of heart attacks, back to the level of upset stomachs, back to the level of the body in jeopardy. Now we recognize this because we've seen in our education, we've seen how there's an alternation of a phase of process with a phase of objectivity. And we saw that it began with the a process phase, began with nature, that nature was not in any way objective, but a process that happens, that something that is ongoing, a matrix of change. And out of that, existence becomes objective. And existence posits itself. It is posited in the body. The body as our example of species, our particular species, Homo sapiens sapiens, our particular species, man. Our body is the first objective occurrence of our species, of our Homo sapiens sapiens, of our mankind, of our humanness. Nothing in the universe is objective before existence. Before existence, there is only a ceaseless process of change called nature. And as existence is the objective precipitation out of the process of nature, we saw that there is a second process. And that second process is one of language. And we called that, by its traditional name, myth. And that the process of language is one of ceaseless change, just like nature. Language, in fact, is very parallel to nature. And that's why, generally on the first level, words stand for things. But they stand for things which have achieved existence. And so, while you can say that the process of language is parallel to the process of nature, its connection with nature is only through ritual, only through the things of ritual. So that the words of language, the names of things, are the root core for language. The verbs are names for ritual actions. The nouns are names for ritual things. The adjectives are words, names for modifications of those things, of those processes. Notice here that in this process of language there is a pairing again, and that the pairing, based on existence, turns out to have the following bifurcation: things and events. And we will see in Thucydides, in his history, he's concerned with this basic pair, this basic bifurcation. But the things that he's concerned with are people, individuals. They are the things of the process of history. And what's paired with them are the events. So people and events as a pair. And he holds that parallel frame of reference unrelentingly in his consciousness. When he looks to select and review out of everything that is happening, he selects by using this kind of tuning fork of keeping the pairedness of people and events. The Greek term for events here is erga, like we get our English word eventually, energy, or ergs, erga. And individuals are characterized largely by their biographical quality. And you find great biographies laced through Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. But the ace center of the individual is revealed in the way in which they use their language. And so the Greek word for these speeches which characterize the essence of these individuals are called logoi. Logoi. And so 500 years before the logoi of Thomas about Jesus, 500 years before St. Thomas writes down the sayings of Jesus to convey the personality of Jesus, the archetype of that kind of thing is here in Thucydides for the very first time in the world. There's sometimes someone who pioneers it, and Thucydides pioneers this. But what's devastating about Thucydides is the pairing of the logoi and the erga, the speeches and the events, that they go together in such a way, a universal way, that if you hold them together, if you learn to use consciousness to see form and process by holding this frame of reference, by holding the logoi and the erga together, one gets for the very first time a sense of the movement of the real theme. And the Greek word that Thucydides uses for this is kinesis. Generally means, in Greek of this time, disturbance. We also get our word kinetic from this. Kinesis. That the true movement of the process of history is being able to follow the thematic synthesizing kinesis. And that it is so hidden, it's so huge as to be invisible, it's so subtle as to be invisible, it's so poignant as to be indistinguishable, until one has some way in order to limit one's seeing, limit one's consciousness. And there it is. And to be able to follow that line in all of its wild sinuousness, to unrelentingly have consciousness follow what is going on in terms of the central synthesizing core of the whole process. And no matter what all of it amounts to, this is the spinal column that integrates it. And if we can understand this, we can understand eventually all of it. And what Thucydides says at the very beginning, this is a poisonous swamp, a sand trap of human energy on such a colossal scale that he wanted to erect this sign, don't go in here. And 2,500 years later, our generations are experiencing the reason why to put up the poison sign. Because once the slide starts, it is only reversed by an enormous revolution, by an enormous radical transformation at the level of vision. Once this process has begun, nothing can stop it. And the only solution to the dilemma, to the problem, is to radically change vision. That's all that can be done. You can't array more power against it. It's already used power to produce the dilemma. You can't array non-participation against it. It's already co-opted all of that. You can't be a more powerful super individual. You're just an more interesting player in a dead-end game. Literally, one finds that the entire telephone book of solutions is irrelevant. And the only workable one, single workable one, is the radical visionary transformation. That's all. That's all that can happen. Now in Thucydides, in this history of the Peloponnesian War, in this keeping the sinuous movement of the theme, of the kinesis, keeping it accurately, one has to first find the beginning of it. Because it is so huge, because it is so subtle, because it is so difficult to follow. If one doesn't know the beginning, you could never come upon this trail partway down. You have to find where it starts. And so all great histories have a beginning. They have a starting point. And in this, they're very similar to myths. All mythologies have a creation story. But while a creation story talks about the creation of everything, in history, the beginning is the beginning, the very first point where one can find the synthesizing trail of the theme. Now for Thucydides, he spends the whole of an introduction and the whole of Book 1 before he gets to the beginning. The beginning of the Peloponnesian War is treated in Book 2. There are 8 books in the whole of the history of the Peloponnesian War. And he begins Book 2 with this sentence: "We now come to the actual outbreak of war between Athens and her allies on one side, and the Peloponnesians and their allies on the other. There was now no further communication between the two sides except through heralds. Once the war began, it continued without intermission. I have recorded the events as they occurred each summer and each winter." Now just a little bit of background here. Greece, classical Greece, shaped like this. The Peloponnese is the large area of Greece to the south. This area down here. What you might think as the major southern portion of Greece. The Peloponnese is the most basic Scythonius indigenous populations of Greece. Sparta was characteristically the head city because of its military prowess, because of its ancient plain kingship. The Spartans were famous. We still have the word in English, Spartan, which means minimal decoration, very little frills. And in fact, in Sparta, men and women were trained for warfare the same. And they were largely trained nude. They were trained to fight with sword and shield, javelin, in groups, together, nude, so that there was nothing in between. The bare basic reality of military prowess and their own ritual nature. The heads of Spartan society, there was a king at the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. His name was Archidamus. And there were ephors who were in charge like elders of the city. And Sparta was like ancient peasant Greece. Landlocked, the basic power was in an army, and the basic power was in sticking together and getting all of the towns and villages to fight together as one. Athens, on the other side, was a far-flung empire. Its power was in navy, naval ships. Its ships could go anywhere. It was mobile, whereas Sparta was collected. Whereas the Spartan infantry was the source of its power, Athens' source of power was fantastic diplomatic acrobatics to piece together far-flung islands as far as Corfu and Zakynthos, all the way across to the Aegean up to Lesbos, Chios, most of the Cyclades, and just a few places on the mainland. Athens and its surrounding countryside of Attica, and the countryside over towards the area of the Adriatic. What is the Adriatic Sea? There was 3 or 4 little kingdoms. So Athens was far flung, and Sparta was condensed. Sparta was very plain. Athens was extremely sophisticated. And the Athenians considered themselves always as the cream of the creme. They were the upper class of Greek life. They were the aristocrats of Greek life. And Athens as a place, as a city, was the downtown of Greek language civilization. They pointed out that while in ancient times it's true that there were kings in places like Argos, where Hera had her wonderful shrine. There were kings in places like Mycenae, places like Tiryns, and that Sparta was of this kind, ancient, traditional, land-bound, peasant stock, plainness. But that Athens had been founded by the incredible conscious bravery and courage of a single individual who beat the odds of fate, who pulled out of an impossible situation a victory for himself and for the spirit of a courageous adventuring people, Theseus. That Theseus had been able to pull out of the stubborn power of the bull, had been able to pull out his lady fair, had been able to rescue from the Minotaur, had been able to use his daring individual courage to beat the power of Autochthonian forces. The powers of the earth were defeated by a celestial hero. And so Athens styled itself as the city of celestial heroes. And all through its history, there were great individuals, Erechtheus and Cecrops and many other individuals for over 1,000 years that had set up a fantastic showplace. The original city had been where the Acropolis is now, just the top of the Acropolis and the south-facing bank. All through this development, Athens was always the spectacular place. It was the New York of its day. And everyone else was podunk. Now, just before the Peloponnesian War broke out in 431, for 100 years before then, Athens had outshone every place on earth. They had outshone even its own spectacular heritage. And for the 100 years before the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, at least a dozen, maybe a score of the greatest individuals who have ever lived in this city, and almost all at the same time. You had people like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Socrates and Herodotus and Pericles, and a whole list of people could be made who are famous now and have been famous since their own day. And Thucydides points out that this was one of the basic causes of the war, that this is an eternal cause of this particular kind of polarized situation that's always there lurking in a civilization exactly at its apex. that the Spartans were jealous and fearful of the Athenians because of their glamour, because of their high-handedness, that if they had power, military power, to go along with this, they would make slaves of everyone else. Whereas Athens was extremely protective of its own glory and considered any threat to its glory to be a threat against the civilization of Greece. They were the defenders of the civilization, of the advance of the civilization. Whereas the Spartan side saw that it was this civilization itself that was the problem. These are the fancy people. These are the highfalutin people who are taking us farther and farther away from basic cultural norms, from the values which we have always had in our villages, in our tribes, in our families, in our traditions. That Athenian civilization is leaching away the very core of the ancient Greek culture. And so it's a tussle between culture and civilization, between the mythic level and the historical level. There were no, I repeat, there were 0 historians in Sparta. Zip. There were no tragedians in Sparta. There was nobody writing comedy in Sparta. There are no philosophers from Sparta. There are no great artists from Sparta. There are no great statesmen from Sparta. A Roman traveler named Pausanias, traveling through some 400 years later, was shocked to look at what Sparta was in his time. He said it's a little goat-filled village, and one can hardly believe that this could ever have threatened one of the greatest cities of all time, which in his time was like the university of the world. I could hardly believe it. It is a polarity which is there not because of the country bumpkins versus the uptown smoothies. It's synthesizing thread, theme, polarity is the war between myth and history. The Nazis in Germany were on the side of mythic, tribal, reactionary viciousness to save their values precisely against a civilization that was teaching people not to honor them anymore. That's why that particular war was fought. We want the happy warrior to stand in his Panzer tank and bring back the old days with the courage of bloodlust of the ancient warriors. These people with their new ways are leeching away at our energy, at our pride. We need to teach them a lesson. This ancient quality of the preservation of cultural tradition is the very essence of human experience, as we've seen in our education. Myth is not about mythic stories. Myth is about the very basis of language conveying experience and feeling. So that essentially the Peloponnesian War is a war between the experience of a people and their basic feeling against a transformational consciousness of individuals pioneering something new. And the more that they pioneer something new, the more that the old mythic feeling experience disappears and some who knows what new thing happens. And that this new thing, as it takes shape, takes the shape of objects of science. Put in the blunt way in which the 19th century would-be savants put it, it's a war between religion and science. It's a war between the tribe and the individual. It's a war between people who share feeling and individuals who share a conscious vision. It's a war between cultures and civilization. Now, when put in these terms, when couched in this way, you can see that the problem is enormously complex and one hardly knows, well, which side to be on. Isn't there some way to work in some of all of these values? And the answer is the only way to work in all of these values is to have a comprehensive education like this. And consequently, the most comprehensive educator of that whole era, Plato, grew up during the Peloponnesian War. All of his work is an attempt to heed the poison signs posted by Thucydides and find some way in which we can teach ourselves and teach each others and educate and learn how to distinguish consciously without destroying the mythic experiential basis. There must be some way to do it. How to do it, no one knew. And that ignorance extended for at least 500 years. No one knew how to do that. For at least 500 years. And the development around the 1st century AD in the Hellenistic world was the development of a way of salvation. A way of salvation where the soul, the feeling, qualitative, experiential soul, is saved from destruction by the conscious development of civilization. That one finds some way to bring the earthly soul into the heaven of higher consciousness. And that's what the whole situation was about in the 1st century AD. Unfortunately, the solution was found too late. As was pointed out by many great historians in the later classical world, not only did Athens and Sparta exhaust each other, but they exhausted the entire Greek world. So that someone outside on the periphery of that Greek world eventually came along and just simply co-opted all of the energy. And that individual was Alexander the Great, who was a Macedonian. He was not an Athenian. He was not a Spartan. He was from the far north. They were actually, in the time of the Peloponnesian War, barbarians. They were outside the pale. Now we're going to take a break, but I want to make just one more point here, because we're not studying Thucydides. We're not studying the Greeks. We're looking at history from our particular process of maturation. So difficult and so profound is this, that unless it is given a juxtaposed angle of vision, there's no way that we would even remember, much less be able to imagine anything of value out of this. And there have been many students who have just simply let it go, chosen not to show up, not to pursue it, got other things to do. There's nothing else to do in this world at this time than to get out of the burning house where we are. we're cutting this particular work with another, Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. Rarely has there ever been an individual more consciously developed than Benjamin Franklin. And so we're cutting Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War exactly at an angle which will hold in terms of this particular structure, this particular book. Remember that the frame that he's using are individuals, especially in their speeches, their logoi, their sayings, and erga, events, what happens. So Benjamin Franklin, as an individual, talking about the events of his life, exactly cuts into, juxtaposes to the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides in a very rarefied way, if I may say so. Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War is a jewel, one of the jewels of Western civilization. But we're going to recut this jewel using Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, and instead of having a square-shaped jewel, we're going to have a pear-shaped jewel. We're recutting Thucydides by using Benjamin Franklin. Because in a very real way, Benjamin Franklin is one of the greatest geniuses of all time. He found a way to bring back into play the solution that was achieved in the 1st century AD but couldn't be put into effect because by that time the whole world was co-opted by Roman power. And we already have discussed the way in which the founder of the Roman Empire, Augustus Caesar, simply considered himself furthering on the achievement of Alexander the Great. He was the new Alexander the Great, but whereas Alexander the Great was a great general, a great military man, and had gotten a worldwide empire but didn't know how to keep it, how to administrate it, Augustus, more than anyone, knew how to pick and hold the people who could administrate for him this empire. And the true genius of Augustus Caesar was that he was able to keep, through promises, through subtlety, through terror, through overwhelming power, through mythic associations, he was able to keep for 44 years a whole population of excellent people, excellent in that they were good managers of whatever you had to manage. If you need to build roads across the whole of a continent, they did it. What was, when Augustus took over, simply the Via Flaminia and the Via Appia, by the time he was finished, those roads extended everywhere from Iran to Ireland, and they were all controlled by milestones that read in numbers referring back to milestone number 0, which was in the Roman Forum. All roads lead to Rome was the formula for the power of the Roman Empire. And the solution that Jesus came up with in the beginning of the 1st century AD, the solution of how to save the soul of the experience of a feeling being in nature so that it can exist in an exalted conscious universe of cosmos, of scientific cosmos. While that couldn't be put into effect in the 1st century AD, it was attempted to be put into effect in the 18th century by Benjamin Franklin. And indeed, Franklin, using some of the techniques developed by Augustus Caesar, simply helped mature several generations of individuals who were able to put it into an effect. In a way, Benjamin Franklin created the set of geniuses that made the United States. And he did this single-handedly. It was not a committee. It was just a man Hell of a man. So we're going to use Thucydides and Benjamin Franklin together because what we are after here is to understand how history relates to our individuality, and that our individuality is that locus, that beginning point by which any synthesizing theme that would make a history that would include us can be not only discovered, but determined, imagined, remembered, pioneered, developed. Let's take a break and we'll come back. The favorite Jewish philosopher on vanity was Koheleth, also known as Ecclesiastes. And according to him, there is a time for vanity as well as a time for anything else. I'd like to just remind you that there are films that go with history. The films are Apocalypse Now, Lawrence of Arabia, and Gandhi. And I would suggest that if you're going to see them, try and see them in that order. Apocalypse Now, Lawrence of Arabia, and Gandhi. They're all on video. And the music for history is Ralph Vaughan Williams' Symphony No. 7, Symphonia Antarctica. And you might be able to get a CD of this, or even a cassette. Now, the Symphony No. 7 by Ralph Vaughan Williams was the music to a film. It's the only film music that I know. The film score was taken and made into a symphony. The film was Scott of the Antarctic, which is out on video now, with John Mills. And the synthesizing theme that runs all the way through the kinesis of Symphony No. 7 is water. Water. That water is essential for life, but when water freezes into ice, it stops life. And that Antarctica is a continent of ice, and that the movement of these men, Commander Scott and his expedition, were going to the South Pole and back, and they were in a race with Amundsen. And Amundsen used dog sleds, whereas the British used mechanical tractors and ponies. And the tractors broke down and the ponies died, and so they had to pull the material themselves, and because of this, they exhausted themselves, and on the way back from the South Pole, they all died one by one. And in the following year, rescuers went in, and they found the men, and they found their diaries. And all of the diaries of these men showed a tremendous spiritual energy and camaraderie between them all. And in all of the diaries was a belief, was a conviction that all of the men were together, that even those that died earlier, that they were still spiritually, psychically with them, pulling, man-hauling, and that this conviction was not the fantasy of one, but was the belief and conviction of all of them, that they were eternally together through their courage and determination to make it back. And the theme of Vaughan Williams' symphony is that sometimes we are outdistanced by conditions against us. It has nothing to do with the fact that you're not courageous or that you didn't win because of some fault. It's just simply sometimes you're outdistanced by the conditions arrayed against you. So Vaughan Williams' Symphony No. 7, Symphonia Antarctica, there are several versions of it. Actually, the first one, Sir Adrian Boult, is probably the one that I'm most familiar with. Andre Previn is okay, and there are others. Let's come back to history. Let's come back to Thucydides. Let's come back to Benjamin Franklin. let's recap just for a moment. History is a conscious process, and it is complementary to a natural process which is called myth. And that natural processes give way to conscious processes, and natural forms give way to conscious forms. Or to put it in a more structural language, any form that can be integrated can be transformed, and the differential forming that comes out of this is more powerful than the integrated form. Differential forms are more powerful. Differential processes are more powerful. That is to say, in this ladder of efficacy, sometimes in ancient times called Jacob's ladder, as a matter of fact. As one goes up the rungs of Jacob's ladder, one comes closer and closer to the heavens, to the celestial realm. And this celestial realm is the cosmos, the actual fact, the objective fact of the cosmos. But that the last rung before one reaches an objective cosmos where you could be at home, the last rung before that is history. And it is not objective at all. It is a process. But even more difficult, it is a differential process. And the only differential process which we have any acquaintance with at all before history is vision. So that in a way, vision is resonant with history. And the language of vision, which is called prophecy, prophetic language, has a resonant, how can I say it? There's an oscillation. There's a resonant oscillation that history follows the cue of visionary language, which is what makes prophecy, real prophecy, so effective. Someone who can speak the magic language of prophetic vision in the right way will set the tone of the way in which the history develops. But it's not a guarantee. It's just simply a headwind. History has to be consciously navigated by individuals. Only individual persons are able to traverse the ocean of history. In a very peculiar way, individuals can work together and make forms that will traverse history. But they cannot use cultural forms. And their coming together has to be on the basis of individuals, not on the basis of tribe. Their coming together has to be on the basis of visionary thought shared, not on the basis of feelings shared. Feelings held in common are ineffectual of holding together the forms that can actually navigate history. The tribal values, the cultural values, wonderful as they are not operatively effective in the process of history. Why? Because those tribal values, those cultural values, those feeling, experiential, mythic values are integral in nature. And history is a differential process. It simply dissolves. First thing it dissolves are those values. So one has to have differential values that will hold, not hold together as in tightly, but hold as the differential process of history progresses, that the forms play better and better. Remember the cue of Walt Whitman in his great Democratic Vistas. Though he ascribes it to Mother Nature, it's actually true of the conscious cosmos. He says, nature seems to respect only two things, freedom and variation. This is a conscious vision. Whitman's very conscious. By 1870, he was a very conscious individual. One of the best ever. A real yogi. But it's in the differential process of history that freedom and variability are respected. So that the forms that cross history are those that have the greatest freedom and the greatest variability. They're able to absorb the vicissitudes as a part of their operation. Whereas if you try to put together some kind of cultural form on an integral basis, using feeling as an integrating, synthesizing center, history is of such a nature, vision already is of such a nature, that it completely dismisses this. So that the goodness of cultural values on the mythic level is simply ignored in the differential conscious universe. They are not ignored out of malice. There's no evil genie in charge. There's no demiurge in charge. They are ignored structurally. Energy simply doesn't work that way. So that an education that really is of service to human beings who are going to go beyond the level of the tribe, who are going to mature beyond a cultural milieu, who are going to go into consciousness, going to go into vision, go into the forms of the person, of the personality, go into the processes of history, and actually achieve objective livability in the cosmos. Literally, return to heaven. Return to the heavens. Be at home among the stars. Literally. It requires a transformational vehicle called an education. And that's what this is. Now, the first attempt to do this sort of thing on a conscious basis, inclusive, was Plato. Because Plato came, he was raised, he grew up in the time of the Peloponnesian War. All of the events that Thucydides narrates in his history was the childhood which Plato experienced. And not only Plato, but Euripides, Aristophanes. And much of the poignancy that's there in Plato, in Euripides, in Aristophanes, much of that poignancy, which is not there in Aeschylus, a different kind of excellent high-flown wonder is there in Aeschylus, in Pindar, in Sophocles, in Herodotus. The even elegant gaze of Sophocles is unruffled by events or people. Sophocles is so even-toned that he is one of the great figures in all of this planet for evenness of temperament. The man who followed him so closely that many of his early plays were in competition with the later plays of Sophocles, Euripides, is tortured. He's anguished. He lives a life of angst because for him, the calm of Sophocles had been betrayed permanently. When one reads Euripides' Bacchae, you see there a poignancy which is not there even in Oedipus Rex. Oedipus Rex is a tragedy of universal form and circumstance coming into a non-personal play, Whereas in the Bacchae, one sees the entire classical civilization of Greece shredded before your eyes. Every single value that is held up and proven to be vacuous, empty. One is reminded of the old Euripides at the end of the Bacchae. One is reminded of the self-portrait that Michelangelo did of himself when he painted the back of the Sistine Chapel, not the ceiling, but the back wall, the Last Judgment. And in the center of the Last Judgment is the Lord God Yahweh. And he looks out with this demanding expression, and in his left hand he holds a pelt, and the pelt is that of Michelangelo. Completely sucked out are the bones that would hold the structure, the flesh that would have been there, the life that would have been there. Just the empty bag of skin of Michelangelo. Because towards the end of his life, Michelangelo, like the old Euripides, lived in a time period where every single value that was understood had been sucked out dry, withered, and left with nothing. Less than nothing, left with a regressive bitterness. Now, one finds in Thucydides a consciousness of this. For the first time in human life on this particular planet, a consciousness that one is dealing here not with bad guys who belong to a different culture from us, different type of people, and that's why we're fighting, but that some larger shape has grabbed both people, both sets of people, and that this larger archetype has distributed the energies of everyone according to its own categories. We have been diced up, Thucydides says in his own way, we have been diced up and distributed into the pawns of a mechanical readout situation which we have no defense against because we don't even understand that we are caught up in this kind of meat grinder. Not only meat grinder, spirit grinder. And that this form is so monstrously subtle and huge that unless other human beings are forewarned against this, they will fall into the same trap. They will go into the same poisonous swamp. And indeed, we've seen that even in our own time, our own lives were ground up. Several generations were ground up in a war which spanned most of the 20th century. In his Nobel Prize speech, William Faulkner in 1954 said, "We have been inundated by fear on such a scale and level that we have even forgotten that we are numbed by it. That this war has been going on since 1914, and by 1954 it had gone on for 30 years with only seeming breaks. But that actually the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War were separate lunges. They were separate waves in the same set. And this war lasted until the early 1990s. 1914 to almost 1994, 70 years. That's more than 3, almost 4 generations of people. So that not only us, but our parents, our grandparents, our children, were all swept up again into this form. The very form that Thucydides is seeking to delineate. He's not writing a history of Greece. He's not writing a history of Athens. He's writing a history of this war, because this war discloses the skin, the claws, the teeth of a differential beast that has cultures for breakfast It has whole peoples for lunch. It eats natural mankind without remorse. That's why it's always held its own as one of the greatest classics on the planet. It doesn't matter who you are, where you've come from. Now, in Thucydides, in doing this, he needed to find some vehicle by which he could keep track of this subtle, sinuous movement, this kinesis, this disturbance thread. How can we see something that is so subtle, so enormous, so complex? By what means? What kind of cues? What kind of measurement? What are the footsteps? What are the vertebrae by which we can see this? And he says there are two, and they always go together. One is character, people, individuals. That no matter how complex it is, no matter how subtle it is, no matter how huge it is, individuals count. By keeping track of the persons involved, one follows the money. One follows what this is. And the pair, along with the people, is to keep track of the events. That the events always have to be functions, reverberatory functions that occur because of interchanges between people. That they are not abstract ideas that just happen by themselves, but they are the direct resonances, not to say results, but the resonances of decisions, of views, of visions, of individuals. So that the events and the individuals. So Thucydides is fond of biography. He's one of the world's great biographers. But in order to hone and refine and keep sharp, to keep the edge of the knife sharp so that he can dissect without destroying it, he sees that individuals are summed up by the individual use of expressive language by which they characterize their vision of the world. The conscious, personal, individual speeches, and we have a name from the classical Greeks for this, the orations. The orations of individuals are the ace ultimate documents by which one could understand the footsteps and the sources of the resonant events, so that if you could pair events with the speeches, the logoi, the Greek word is logoi, if you can pair events and logoi together, if you can get these two, you can make then a sequence by which one can follow the synthesizing line and understand the history. What is happening? Where did it begin? Where is it going? What does it mean? And that once one is in possession of this information, you can then take this information with you and apply it to every other aspect of life. Once you have Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War under your arm, then you could write a history of Greece. Then you could do a cultural history of mankind. Then you would be in a position finally to understand anything that would ever come up on any level, to any degree of expansion, to any degree of concentration. In other words, a history like this is a conscious tool by which actual people can get themselves across the vicissitudes of history to an objective other shore. It is a very, very, very great work. And it's the first work like it ever written on the planet. But because individuals in Thucydides, in fact, one of the great commentaries published by Cambridge University Press is called Individuals in Thucydides. Thucydides' individuals are so complex, and their pairedness with events are events that to us happened so long ago. We don't have the background to really understand all the significance, all the vicissitudes. We don't have the time to put into it. So we're taking a shortcut, and that's where Benjamin Franklin's autobiography comes in. Here is one of the all-time great individuals who is writing his own biography, autobiography. And in the biography, he is pairing together his sayings. Did you not know Benjamin Franklin is as famous as Jesus with his sayings? The wit and wisdom of Benjamin Franklin. You know, he published one of the first newspapers in Philadelphia, one of the first newspapers in the New World. For decades, he brought out Poor Richard's Almanac, which was the #1 home resource book. If there were 2 books in a household in early North America, it was the Bible and Poor Richard's Almanac for that year. And interspersed through Poor Richard's Almanac are little pithy wisdom sayings by Benjamin Franklin, his logoi. One of my favorite sayings of Benjamin Franklin, he said that God sends meat, the devil sends cooks. Oh, I'm sure you've heard early to bed, early to rise makes a man wealthy, healthy, and wise. The sayings of Benjamin Franklin in his autobiography, and the sayings here are enlarged to whole pages, whole sets of pages, are paired to events. Events that led not only to the living of a life, but events that led to the making of the United States. In a very real way, George Washington's not the father of the country. He might be a favorite uncle. But the semen came from the mind of Benjamin Franklin. The impregnation is due to Benjamin Franklin. His love-making with the cosmos made the baby that became born on the 4th of July, 1776. It's true the officiating doctor was Thomas Jefferson. But when one reads the accounts, one can see that Franklin was already choreographing everything even before Jefferson was born. One of Franklin's most famous little snippets that he published in a newspaper and a magazine and in several books was The Snake of Wisdom. And it was cut into 13 pieces labeled by the initials of the 13 colonies. And by this he was visually showing there's no energy separate, but you put them together and you get the first American flag, which had a little Benjamin Franklin saying on it, "Don't tread on me." Franklin was against making the eagle the national bird. He said the turkey, believe it or not, the turkey should be the national bird. The turkey will feed you while the eagle feeds on you. Well, you can see which way it went. Alexander Hamilton loved the eagle because money and power is the way kingdoms are made. But Franklin didn't want to make a kingdom. He was not on the side of cultures. He was not on the side of the tribes. He was not on the side of myth. And it's not that they're on a side, but it's that they are a phase in the integration ecology, which is nature, and do not occur in consciousness progressively. Because just as vision displaces nature, magic displaces nature. A transcendent, transformed realm always will displace a natural realm. And just as vision displaces nature so that nature becomes subconscious and now vision becomes a conscious form of it, the same way art displaces ritual. As art happens, ritual takes a subconscious level. And when vision and art are working together, nature and ritual are subconscious. And when history comes into play, more and more, myth joins nature and ritual in the subconscious. So that you have a consciousness that has a square. The only thing left from the natural ecology are symbols. The integration of symbols. So if you have the integration of symbols and the differentiation of vision, the differentiation of art, and the differentiation of history. And that particular square leads itself with an incredible ease into the transformation of symbols into cosmos, symbols into science. The cosmos is a scientific nature, not a cut and dried science, but an understandable, detailed, vibrant, expanding, conscious nature, a cosmos. The self-realization, that's the epitome of the symbolic mind, becomes the differential presence of God in the cosmos. And at that point, the whole ecology of the four phases of nature have transformed into the four phases of consciousness. And the universe is then conscious. The whole universe is all conscious. But the difficulty is there with history. Because at history, one is dealing initially at the starting point, when history begins, one is dealing with a 50-50 proposition. The square, the four quarters that are operative, two of them are integral and two of them are differential. And as soon as you tilt the scales one step towards the differential, one step into history, the reaction starts on the integral side because it doesn't want to slip into subconsciousness. It doesn't want to go there. It's been kingpin for, if not hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions of years. Why is it going to give up? The tribe is not going to give up its power. The culture is not going to let its values be transformed. Feeling is not going to let conscious process like history override it. Experience is so fundamental, so ingrained, it will not confirm. It literally refuses to see the differential proportions and scales of conscious history. You can show Thucydides to every member of a tribe, and none of them will be able to read it. They won't hear a thing. They won't understand a thing. It means nothing to them. Nothing. So one is up against a stacked deck. The solution to this, the massive solution to this, is to keep from sliding into a culminating war, which then, in a very stylistic way, freezes the opposition into polarity. Not the polarity that one thinks it's frozen into, Spartans versus Athenians, city people versus village people, East versus West, Americans versus Soviets. Those are masks. They're very great issues. They're very great polarities. In their own right, they have a lot of justification, but as Krishna tells Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, that is not it. Those are rationalizations compared to the real mind. Arjuna says to Krishna, I am the greatest warrior of my time, but I can't go into battle. These men are my relatives. And Krishna says, this is very true, Arjuna, but that, however true that is not why you're not going into battle. There's a deeper reason. Something deeper than the founding of existence is involved. Something even more important than existence. Something even more important than cultural relationalities. Something even deeper than the structures of the mind is involved here. And Krishna says to Arjuna, he says, Arjuna, what is important for you is to take a moment in this eternal moment which we have to converse with each other, and to recognize that you cannot even see the deeper reason because you do not allow yourself the realization pause wherein you could begin to see. You must first of all allow for the pilot light of realization to come on before you can light the torches of freedom and variation so that you can see what's going on. It's the very same language that Plato uses in his great, huge dialogue called The Republic, a dialogue the size of Versailles. And in Book 10 of The Republic, Plato uses what is called the myth of the cave. It's ironic that it should be called a myth. It's absolutely astounding that it should be called a myth, because it is anything but a myth. It is an extended sequential logoi to disclose why the mythic consciousness doesn't work. Not that it's wrong, not that it's old-fashioned, not that it's inadequate. None of those are the reason. The reason it doesn't work is that you're out in space and you have no air, and so those wings are not going to work. You're in an environment where the structure of myth, the structure of experience, no longer works. Experience only works in an integrating nature. That's the only place, and it's wonderful that it is there, because that's absolutely essential. But experience is irrelevant to the perils of conscious history. And it's not a bitter lesson to learn. It's just simply the lesson that one needs to see in terms of how to work with where you are. Job says, curse the day I was born. Better for me that I had never been born than to be caught in the trap I am now caught in. Because you cannot unlearn that consciousness. If you let it go, it sweeps into a regression, and it seeks the last place where it had any kind of bedrock to be firm in. The individual, once the person is rejected as the basis for doing something about what is happening in that situation called history, once the person is rejected and no longer depended upon, no longer relied upon, the next level where there was any objectivity at all is the mind. And most people have never trained their mind enough to be a place where there is some stability. Thomas Jefferson, yes, but... And so they regress even further. Once you reject the personal objectivity, once the individual is discounted, dismissed, let go of, one falls through the symbolic mind, through the ideas, all the way back to ritual. And there they find some place in which to stand, like Martin Luther. Here I stand. We must do such and so and such and so, and then we will be safe. And for your own protection, we are going to see that you do such and so. You will thank us later. As John Calvin remarked in Geneva, when his best friend was being burned at the stake, he heaped another faggot on the fire. He said, "This is good for your soul. You'll be purified. You'll be much better." William Holden in The Bridge on the River Kwai says, "This kind of thinking can get us all killed." The important thing is not how to die like your conception of a hero, but how to live like a human being. And it is hard, but the alternatives are unacceptable. So we're using here Benjamin Franklin to give us an angle into Thucydides, and the angle in is the individual personality of Benjamin Franklin. He is an exemplary kind of individual that Thucydides bases his whole structure of his history on. So the first point of two. The first point is that the individuality of Benjamin Franklin is an accurate index into the structure of Thucydides in respect to individuals and their absolute importance in determining what history is happening. The second point, corollary to that first point, the point of individuals, is that events that are real are always resonances of individual decisions. What really happens in terms of historical differentiation happens because of decisions made by individuals. Somebody's judgment, somebody's decision has started this, has allowed for this to develop, has kept it going. And so and this is not to be identified with ideation. I'm not talking about ideology at all. If you're talking about ideology, you're talking about a regression. If you put it on an ideological basis, then you have the condition that's for all time diagnosed by the great doctor of civilization, Karl Mannheim, in his great book, Ideology and Utopia. As soon as you displace the individual decision-making capacity and begin trusting in ideology, it's a regression back to the symbolic mind. And the symbolic mind, even though it's in that square of vision, art, history, the symbolic mind is an integrating energy and doesn't function except in a polarizing, antagonistic way with the differential consciousness. And so an ideology always then seeks to reverse the situation, turn history back into myth, just like the Nazis. They don't have any goddamn use for history. We want our myth. And not only that, but to reverse art. We don't want this decadent Matisse. We want things that Albert Speer has designed for the Third Reich, for the good of the German people. But the regression goes even further. We don't want vision. We want to get back to the basics of nature. The powerful should rule. Those who prepare for war should win. And so that's why Mannheim wrote his book, because he was just filled up to here with the crap. It's not only wrong, it's wrong, 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 wrong. It's wrong all along a whole spectrum. And one can consciously show exactly why. Here, 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 here. Enough red checks on the page to ruin the calligraphy. The title deed to the Third Reich can be edited by someone like Karl Mannheim so that it's worthless. Because that ideology then projects out a fantasization called a utopia. The cosmos is not a utopia. The cosmos is real. The heavens. Galaxies in such large numbers and such vast structures that there are bubbles 400 million light years across where there isn't a single star, because that's part of the grand foam of the shore. There isn't any ideology that comes anywhere near, because those ideologies, being of an integral nature, always recursively lead back to the old myths, but this time not the old myths in an energetic, vital way, but the old myths in like clipping the wings of the young. They lead back to the old rituals, back to that superstitious level, where you've got to get a black goat and you've got to have its blood on the dark of the moon, and you can't do anything till you've got that. It's a regression that leads away and considers consciousness the enemy. And Thucydides says this is exactly what happened in the Peloponnesian War, that Athens was identified with an impossibly bright, dazzling civilization that the Spartans had no use for. Not only the Spartans, but most of the whole of the land area of Greece. They were autochthonous people. They didn't want this far-flung naval empire of grace and whipped up ideas. They wanted to have the goats. They wanted to have the values of the old times. And Thucydides points out that Athens, instead of championing the situation as a people, took up the challenge of the Spartans on the level of the Spartans. Instead of continuing to work on the civilization, they prepared for war. And that the war stopped the civilization like hitting a stone wall. It never worked again. Never. There was no Athenian empire after this. After 400 AD, that was it. Other places, other people. 50 years later, Alexander the Great was born way up in Macedonia, and within 15 years, he was already taking over what Philip, his father, had set up as an empire that just simply swept the old Athenian league into some larger structure, as if it were nothing. Alexander was less received in Athens than he was in Persepolis. In Persepolis, at least, they were willing to either fight with him or negotiate somehow. But in Athens, they were brutal. They wouldn't let him into the city, and they said, "We will only help you under one condition, that if you capture the capital of the Persians, you will burn it to the ground." Alexander was trying to put together a world civilization. He didn't want to burn the other capital to the ground. He wanted the Persian and the Greek peoples, the Persian language and Greek language peoples, to be one people. He had all of his officers marry Persian women so that their children would never again be Greeks or Persians. They would be human beings. And as soon as Alexander died, they all divorced the wives except one. Seleucus was the only one who kept his wife. And Seleucus lived the longest of them all and founded a house that lasted for hundreds of years. The only one. But the Athenians made it a condition, and it sabotaged the whole development of world civilization. Because the Persians have never forgiven Alexander the Great for burning Persepolis. Never, to this day. That whole area of Asia suspects the West on the basis of this archetype. They talk a good game. When they get into your house, you'll lose it all. It was a carryover from the history of the Peloponnesian War times. A drop of the poison that Thucydides was talking about brought this curse upon Alexander's ecumeny right up until 1995. Still has never been cured. Even though the records have been examined the last 30, 40 years, and one can see that the decision to burn Persepolis was not Alexander's at all, but the only way that he could keep the Athenian-based section of the Greek world in the ecumeny. And his idea was to rebuild, burn Persepolis, and then rebuild it. But he died before he could rebuild it. This quality, the quality of being trapped in a pernicious dilemma, is what Thucydides is all about. That when you get into a historical bind, the energies of history are so high, they're the most differential energies there are. And when you get into a bind there, the more that energy that you put into the bind, into the situation that's become a bind, the faster and deeper the regression goes. And that as we talked about 2 weeks ago, one of the most peculiar of all yogas is the yoga of doing nothing at all in that situation. It's the yoga of Lao Tzu. That when you're caught in a bind of high differential consciousness, the resolving situation is to practice Wu Wei. Doing nothing at all. Doing specifically exactly nothing at all. And the intelligence behind this is that the achievement of vision as a differential process has already occurred. The vision is already there. It's operating. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a history. And that the individuation of the personality has taken place to such an extent that there are individuals who are real. And if the vision is there working and individuals are real, the historical differential development will happen out of that matrix all by itself. So that the wisdom of Wu Wei, of doing nothing, is the wisdom of recognizing that the ingredients that are necessary to work are already in play. Let them play. It may take a season or so, but eventually they will, of their own structure, of their own accord, of their own differential nature, they will work. But that's the last choice on a list 18,000 miles long. It's the last choice that people, because they're not fully formed as individuals, they don't really share the full vision, They didn't really have the integration of the symbols. They didn't really get the depth of the experience. All that they really had is that they did some of the rituals. And so that flaw carries all the way through. That flaw which begins by somebody fudging on their costume at a ceremony 25,000 years ago turns out later on to be one of the great gaps that allows the whole, what is referred to as the mass of humanity, to not get the situation when there's a historical bind. And the fundamental symptom that they didn't get it is that they fall into a polarizing war, which stops the civilization cold. A doctor of civilization looks at the Cold War and you put your stethoscope away. There isn't anything that you can do at this stage other than precisely Wu Wei. Now that is very difficult. That's a hard medicine to practice. The alternative is that any bright ideas that you have that you put into play are going to be seeds for ideology on people's levels who haven't thought it through for themselves. So that one of the possible resonances of Wu Wei is an education of bringing people up to that competence where they too can practice with you. It was one of the great glories for about 2 months in 1966 that there was a vast intelligence in places like San Francisco and Berkeley of thousands of people doing nothing together and poignantly letting that resonance sound throughout. But pretty soon there were people, hangers-on, who didn't understand that spiritual tact, who thought, this is very peculiar. Here's our chance to be famous. Here's our chance to do stuff. And you're just holding be-ins in places like Golden Gate Park. The poster for it was an American Indian on a horse holding up a peace blanket. And on the peace blanket it said, be in together. Just be in. Not against anything, not for anything. Let's just be together. May of 1966. The guards for it were Hell's Angels. For one brief moment they got it. Ugh! Shit, man, that's fucking cool. Yeah. And by July, the drug sales were booming and the thing was over. By February of the next year, Lyndon Johnson was showing his appendix scar in the shape of Vietnam, according to David Levine in the New York Review of Books. And it was all over. That was it. This quality of dealing with a bind in history was never workable in the 1st century AD. It was never workable after the 30 Years' War in Europe. Never workable in many times. It was workable for one brief moment in one place about 200 years ago. The place where they hit the wall was in France, in the French Revolution. But the American Revolution managed to go from its history into science, into a cosmos, for one brief time. And while the 1840s in Europe are known as the decade of fierce revolutions, In fact, I think there were half a dozen in 1848 alone. There are whole books, whole libraries of books on 1848 as a revolutionary year in Europe. But the 1840s in the United States are known as the era of good feeling. Because for one brief decade, there was a tremendous continental calm where individuals were interested in getting together as individuals and exploring, pioneering something completely unknown. The great example of understanding that in a work of art is a book written by James Fenimore Cooper in 1841 called Deerslayer. He had written already 4 of the novels that would become the Leatherstocking Saga, and then he was on a horse and buggy with his daughter Susan, and they were up above the lake that they called Glimmerglass, and she says in her autobiography that her dad looked out and in a trance looking at Glimmerglass, he said, "I have one more book to write, and that's about the origins of Hawkeye. When he was 16, 17 years old, I want to get his origins when he was still called Deerslayer, before he had ever killed a man. That has to be told because that's indispensable." And that's what Deerslayer is about. It's about a man, a white man raised as an Indian at home in the wilderness, who out of conditions has to kill his first man. And all the conscious travail that came out of that. Try and get your books and try and write your histories, just one page, and I'll look at some of them today. Just bring them back when I'm making the tapes, okay? And I'll help you along as best I can. Try not to drop out. As you can see, this is the stage where people drop like flies.